I'm going to talk about some studies which have taken place in the UK, which have had an influence on policy in early childhood education and care in the UK over the past 30 years. Now, why should we focus on the early years? Well, Hero has already given us some indication for that, but here are two quotes. If the race is already halfway run, even before children begin school, then we clearly need to examine what happens in the earliest years. This is Gosta Esping Andersen, a Danish social scientist. Like it or not, the most important mental and behavioral patterns once established are difficult to change once children enter school. Jim Heckman, Nobel Prize-winning economist. Clearly, there's a heavy emphasis there on the importance of the early years. And the reason for that is because of the build-up of extensive evidence showing that children who suffer early risk factors in their environments are at increased likelihood of poor literacy, numeracy, school failure, unemployment, antisocial behavior, criminality, substance abuse, mental and physical health problems, and so on. Now, when we look at disadvantaged children, they're part of a spectrum. At the top here, we have the children at most risk. And I'm going to be talking about developed countries like the UK for the moment. These children require care and protection by the state, child protection orders, etc. Then we have a group below that who aren't intervened with by the state, but still at a very significant risk. And there's quite a big group here. Then we have a more moderate risk. Then we have children who are with a slight risk, as it were, here. And then we have children who are stable and well. Now, the point I want to make about this pyramid of risk is that for many families, their problems derive from problems with the infrastructure of society. And no amount of counselling, early childhood curricula, home visits will take the place of jobs with decent incomes, affordable decent housing, good health care, optimal family structure, or supportive networks where children encounter positive role models. Okay? You know, you're not going to solve the problems of the world just by changing early childhood education and care, although you can contribute to solving the problems. Now, one area of work that it takes place is where people attempt to change children who are living in disadvantaged circumstances. And an example of an intervention with disadvantaged populations in the UK would be the Sure Start program, which was started in 2000. Now, when we looked at the early results from this program, we found that there were mixed results for these Sure Start local programs. Some positive results, but also some negative results. So it was a very mixed pattern. And what then happened from 2005 on was the Sure Start programs changed to a different model of delivery. Up to 2005, basically these programs had been given money, and it was up to the program to decide what it did with the money. And it was a very large amount of money, £1,000 per child per year in income. Now, given that a typical program serves 600 children, that is £600,000 per year in income, and on top of that, where there would be money for capital projects like building buildings and so on. So these are very substantial sums of money. But they could do what they liked with it. And what we found was some of these programs were doing what might be regarded as useful things. Some of these programs were regarded as doing really almost silly things. I'm not going to go into the full details about this. But anyway. But then we started to show, the evidence from our research project started to show that a particular kind of model was more successful. This is what we call the children's centre model, where you had a set menu of services which ideally would integrate health, early childcare, parenting support, and early education. So from 2005 to 2006, they moved to this children's centre model. And in 2008, when we followed up the programs in a longitudinal study, we started to see positive effects of the programs. So in comparison with comparable children not receiving the programs, better social behavior, cooperation, sharing, and empathy amongst the children, better self-regulation amongst the children, reduced parenting risk, a better home learning environment, and also more service use. In addition, we found some health benefits like improved child immunizations, reduced child accidents. However, we have to be a little bit cautious about claiming these are sure start effects because there happened to be, over those years, a general national improvement in these two outcomes, and it could be that we were capitalizing on that general improvement. I'm being hyper cautious here. All of us who really examine this data know these are really sure start effects. But to be absolutely cautious, I cannot absolutely claim them as that. So why were we getting these better results for sure start programs after an extended period? Well, first of all, it took 3 years to set up a program. That is, you give the programs the money. It takes them 3 years to actually build up a reasonable service. So what was happening in the early phases is the children and families were exposed to relatively immature programs, which were also very diverse in the way I said. And then, so the sheer amount of exposure to the programs early on, or fully functioning programs, was probably very limited. Also, the quality of services improved markedly as the time went on. First of all, because the staff became more experienced in delivering programs, but also they were delivering a more clear set of objectives with the children center model as time went on. Now, in the 2010 report on 5-year-old families and their children, we find basically better parenting outcomes here in terms of life satisfaction, less chaotic home environments, better home learning environments, better physical health amongst the children, and reduced worklessness in the families. That is, they were more likely to find jobs if they had been unemployed. We also found that they were less likely to attend school meetings. We're not quite sure why this happened here, but generally a more favorable effect, primarily in parenting outcomes. But when we followed up the children at 7, what we were finding is that while we had better child outcomes at age 3 and some better child health outcomes at 5, by age 7, the child outcomes had dissipated. And what we think this is because in the middle of doing this Sure Start program, another study, the EPI study, which I'll tell you about in a moment, had produced a change whereby every child in the country was getting free childhood education from age 3. So all of our control group, as it were, was suddenly given a big benefit. And they sort of caught up with the intervention group. So basically, this brings children up to a similar level. But what we also found when we examined within Sure Start program effects, we found that those Sure Start programs which provided better quality early childcare and education were getting better language development amongst those children than the ones who were giving worse quality. There's a report there giving you the evidence. So for Sure Start overall, there were no positive effects of cognitive and language, and this remained stable until age 7. And if Sure Start is to achieve improved child outcomes, it's necessary to improve development at age 3 and boost development subsequently. And particularly, there needs to be a greater emphasis on language development. We found that what was lacking in the implementation of these programs, there were several things lacking, but one thing that stood out was staff's ignorance of fundamentals of child development, and in particular, the role of home stimulation and also center stimulation and childcare stimulation in the development of language skills. And we were finding that as a particular lack, and it's one of our primary recommendations for the improvement of the service subsequently. Okay, I'm going to skip those. Now I'm going to jump back to a study which is a very different perspective. This is a perspective on the general population. This was a study done back in the 1980s. We had 255 children, which we studied from birth to 6 years of age, and we had 4 groups. A home group with no non-parental care. They were at home all the time before school. A relative care group where the parents went back to work and they used a relative, like a grandmother, for childcare while the parents were working. Another group used childminders while the parents were working, and another group used nursery or group care while the parents were working. All of these families were 2-parent families having their first child, where both parents were working up to the birth of the child, and where English was the first language within the home. So they were a distinct subsection of the population, but who varied in their childcare experiences. And we followed these children quite intensively in London across the 80s. And let me say, this time in the UK, before in the 80s, was a time when there was virtually no control of childcare. No state involvement, no control. You know, there were some theoretical things, you can't beat kids and that kind of thing. But nobody ever bothered to look at what was happening. And we wanted to focus on what we now call the quality of care. At that time, the phrase wasn't really in general parlance. And what we knew from the existing research, like attachment research and language development research and so on, that particularly affection in interactions, communication in interactions, and responsiveness in interactions were very important. So we measured these in the children's environments. And this is an example of some of the data. In the home environment, we have blue. The light blue is the lowest levels, the dark blue is the average levels, and the gray is the highest levels. If we look at affectionate acts per hour in direct observation in these environments, we find that the home and the relative are fairly similar, with actually the relative being rather better than the home. This is the grandmother effect. Okay? Then we find that it's a bit less in childminders, but note in childminders a huge range in childminders. Then it's substantially less in group care, less affection in group care environments. These are with children 18 months old. Then we looked at communications happening to the child, from the child, a child language itself, and then child non-language, because 18-month-old children, a lot of their communications will be non-language. And green is the home, blue is the relative, the sort of purple color is childminders, and that gray color is nurseries. And you see there's a very clear difference between those environments in the amount of communications. Homes and relatives, very, very similar, less for childminders and substantially less in group care. Now, not only did we measure communications, we looked at if the child made a communication, how likely would that communication get a response? And what we found was in home environments, it was in excess of 60% of the time. In relatives, it was about 60%, a bit less again, about 50% for childminders, and a bit less for group care nurseries. So there are clear differences in those three dimensions of quality of care in these different environments. Now, these differences in the environmental experience of children might be anticipated to have developmental consequences. And this is an example of this. We looked at the child language throughout the whole study, but this is from 18 months. And one measure we had at 18 months was the child making any word combinations? That is, not just saying a single word, but putting words together. Bye-bye, mama. Give me bottle. Hello, daddy. Those sorts of things, yeah? Now, most 18-month-old children don't show word combinations. They just say single words, or maybe don't have any words at all. And so we see the percentages across these groups here are all above 50%. But then we have some children who have 1 to 4 word combinations, a small number of word combinations. Then we have children with 5 to 9 word combinations. And then we have children with lots of word combinations, 10 plus. Now, look how, as we go down here, we're finding quite high percentages, 17, 23% here, 10, and only 3% here. Okay? What seems to be happening is there's this gradation in the likelihood of the child showing high levels of language development associated with those previous quality of care issues I showed you earlier. And basically, in a regression analysis, which take account of all of the demographics of the family, we find that language development is related to quality of care in the first 3 years, particularly the communication and responsiveness in interactions, and these effects persisted till the end of the study, when the children were 6 years of age. And also we found that stability of care, how many changes of caregiver there were, was associated with quality of care. I think this is one of the very first studies which show conclusive evidence of the link between the quality of the care environment and child outcomes. This results from this study informed the childcare regulations in the 1989 Children Act, which is the first act in the UK which put really rigorous inspection controls for early childhood education and care. Now, similar results have been found in several countries: USA, Bermuda, Australia, several countries. The biggest effects seem to be in the first 3 years for language development. Those children with good language development then tend to do better in literacy and most educational outcomes. And the effects of daycare seem to involve the balance between the quality of home care versus the quality of daycare. So if we have good quality daycare, good quality home care, on this balance here, this is a balance beam, okay? They balance each other out and you get neutral effects. It doesn't really matter whether the child goes to daycare or home care. However, if the quality of daycare is very heavy, as it were, strong, but poor home care, this side will come down and you'll get positive effects. Conversely, if the quality of daycare is rather light and the quality of home care is rather strong, the balance beam will go in this direction and you get negative effects. And this is what we found in this very early study. Where those children were from home environments with good quality care, the effects on language development were most pronounced. Okay. Now I'm going to move on to another study, again with the general population, this time a much bigger study, which started in 1997. It's called the EPI study. And in this study, we had 3,000 children who came from every kind of centre care provision that existed in England at the time of the study. Nursery classes, play groups, which are voluntary, private day nurseries, nursery schools, local authority day nurseries, which cater for at-risk groups, integrated, or what we now call children's centres, which at that time, in the 1990s, were very rare. Only 190 children. And then we had a home group who didn't have any kind of preschool experience. And we interviewed these parents when the child was 3 years old. And we also collected retrospective data from birth onwards, like birth weight, childcare history in the first 3 years, early developmental and behavioral problems and so on. And then extensive data on the family environment, the childcare environment and so on. And then as the children started school, we followed them through school. And now we're about to report on these children when they're 16 years old. So we've got extensive longitudinal data on 3,000 children up to 16 years of age. At the start of school, what we find is, having allowed for all the background demographics of these families, that the quality and duration of their preschool experience matter. So some of the children in this study had 1 to 2 years of preschool. And some of them had 2 to 3 years of preschool. And the zero line would be the no preschool group. And this is the developmental advantage the children are showing over the no preschool group. And we see that more preschool has better effects. Also, quality matters, because green is low quality, blue is average quality, and this purple color is high quality. So there's quality effects and duration effects at the start of school. How do these effects compare with some basic demographic factors? Well, this is the effects on literacy outcomes at the start of school. Here's gender: girls do better than boys. Low birth weight does worse than average birth weight. Duration of preschool: high duration versus no preschool, quite a strong effect. Quality of preschool, moderate effect there. Social class, quite a strong effect. But the strongest effect of all was for the home environment. What do I mean by that? Well, we asked the parents at age 3 about activities in the home with the children. We actually asked about 14 different activities. And we found that there were a particular cluster of these activities which were particularly related to development. And we linked these together to form what we call a home learning environment index. So, to give you an example, we say to a mum, "Oh, does anybody at home ever read to the child?" And some mums say, "Oh, no, don't bother with that, leave it to the school." Okay, that's 0. Others would say, "Oh, I do it every Saturday night when I have a bit of time." And some would say, "I do it every other night," or some would say, "I do it every night." And so you get a variation from 0 to very frequent. And we'd add this up across these different kinds of activities and form this home learning environment. The principle under the home learning environment is that it's trying to get at the opportunities for learning that are provided in the home for the very young child. Now, and what we found is this home learning environment throughout our study has had powerful long-term effects. What parents do is more important than who parents are. We say that because we're finding these effects can sometimes be greater than the social class effects. And you might say, this effect is always, isn't it parent education? Aren't more educated parents going to be doing this? Well, look, in actual fact, we found a correlation between the home learning environment and parent education or parent social class was about 0.3. What this means is there's a slight tendency for it to be better with more educated parents, but we find many examples of highly educated parents who don't do much of it, and conversely, some uneducated parents who do a lot of it. So we can separate out these effects. Now, at age 7 in England, every child in the country takes a national assessment in literacy, numeracy, and science. Here's the results for literacy. The solid line is the preschool group. The dotted line is the no preschool group. And we see for professional families, for skilled families, and for unskilled families, the relative gap is very similar. That is, preschool is helping children across the whole social class spectrum. However, the consequences of that benefit is very different for each social class group. Because this line here, too, is the expected minimum level of attainment for any 7-year-old. So if you're from a professional family, with preschool, you're well above that line. Without preschool, you're well above that line. From a skilled family, you're well above that line with preschool, and you're also above that line without preschool. But if you're from an unskilled family, on average, you're above that line with preschool, but you're below that line without preschool. This has profound educational consequences, being kept down the class, put in special needs, etc., etc. Okay. Now, we also had a methodology which enabled us to pick out which preschool centers were having the most beneficial effect upon children. And then what we did is we picked out some highly effective centers and then some not so effective centers and sent caseworkers into these centers to do qualitative case studies on the ineffective and effective centers, not knowing which were the effective and which were the ineffective. They were, okay? They go out to these centers, spend several weeks in these centers, interview the parents, interview the staff, observe what's happening in centers and so on, come back with their data, and when they finished all the case studies, we say, okay, now we'll tell you these were the effective ones. Let's look at the data and see if there's anything in your data which differentiates these centers. And what we found was there were 5 areas which were particularly important. The quality of adult-child interaction, the knowledge and understanding of the curriculum by staff, the knowledge of how young children learn, or child development was very important. The skill in helping children resolve conflicts was also a factor. And also, helping parents to support children's learning in the home was also a very important factor, distinguishing the more effective centers. Okay, now as the children are growing up, we've got all their home factors, we've got all their early environment factors, we've got all their child factors, etc. But they're going into school. We need measures the school may affect them. So we develop an analysis model which look at child factors, gender, birth weight, ethnicity, family factors like parent education, social class, family size, home learning environment, I mentioned to you. We measured it at 3, we measured it at 6, we measured it at 7, and so on. But over and over again, we found it was the home learning environment measured at 3, which is having the most powerful effects. Preschool, quality and duration of preschool, primary school and secondary school, we took national data for every school in the whole country, for every child in the whole country, measured the progress from start of school to end of school for every child, as a function of demographics for the children in that school, produced an effectiveness score for every school in the country, then selected out which were the schools attended by our EPI children, and we used this effectiveness scores as a factor in our analysis. So we're able to simultaneously model the effects of these variables on outcomes like numeracy, literacy, sociability, behavior problems, or whatever. Okay, what do we find? This is an example of effects at age 14. on literacy and numeracy in national assessments given to every child in the country. Family income is important, about 0.25 of standard deviation on literacy, which is red, and numeracy, which is blue. Then we have the effects of mother's education, about 0.7 of a standard deviation for both. This is the strongest effect of all at this age. Then we have the effects of father's education, about half that of mother's education. So now we know mothers are twice as important as fathers. Okay? Alternatively, we should be telling these fathers to get off their backsides and do a lot more with the children, because that's why we're having these effects. Okay, then having allowed for parent education, we have a social class effect here. But then we have the home learning environment, measured when the children were 3, and these are 14-year-old children. On literacy, it's almost as strong as mother's education, and it's still a very strong effect on numeracy. Okay? Still very powerful effects. 11 years after it was measured. Then we have the effect of going to a high-quality preschool versus no preschool. Quite a strong effect on literacy, an even stronger effect on numeracy. Then we have the primary school effects. Quite a strong effect on literacy, and again, a stronger effect on numeracy. But look at the relative magnitude of these two effects. The effect in our study, in this particular case, is very similar for the variation in preschool experience and the variation in primary school experience. Yet the children had only spent 18 months in preschool. They spent 6 years in primary school. I'll leave you to work out the relative cost benefits of investing in preschool versus investing in primary school. Okay. We're also able to look at outcomes across time and map the developmental trajectories for children, for all these 3,000 children. We can then do what's called a group trajectory analysis to look at whether these trajectories show some common patterns. And we find 6 common patterns emerging for these 3,000 children. Some of our children, about 13% of the children, started off 1 standard deviation above the mean. This would be the mean here. One group were up here, and they stayed up there, all the way from 3 through to age 11 on these common measures on numeracy. We have another group who start off again similarly high, but then fall off to be about average. Then we have 2 large groups who start off around the average. One of these groups climb up and stay consistently above the average. One of these groups fall off and then can stay consistently below the average. Then we have a group down here who start off rather low, but they climb up and then become average. Then we have a group who start off very low here at age 3, and then just stay low all the time. We're about 8% there. There's some lessons we can learn from this. One is, some of these trajectories are favorable. Like, we'd like our child to be in group 6, or maybe group 4. Or maybe if they start off low, maybe group 2. We wouldn't want our child to be in group 3 or group 1. And we can examine what are the factors which differentiate the likelihood of being in a favorable trajectory versus an unfavorable trajectory. And what do we find? It's a good home learning environment in the early years and good quality preschool. They're 2 of the most important factors in differentiating children on these trajectories. But there's another, and I think maybe even more important lesson to be learned from this graph. Suppose I draw a line there, vertically up there. Okay? What's happening to the right of that line? Nothing. Children are staying in essentially the same relative position. All the change is taking place to the left of that line. That's the preschool period, 0 to 5, or up to 5 rather in this case. Yeah. And that suggests that if we want to produce population level change, we need to act in the preschool period. That's not to say you can't get change after that on an individual basis, but if you're talking about population level change, that's the lesson here. There's also an interesting lesson about this group down here. There's a group here, about 8% of the population. If we're going to improve things for this group, we've got to act before age 3, because they've already gone too far. Okay. There was a parallel study that we did in Northern Ireland, which has a slightly different system to England, where the main study took place. 850 children followed through to age 11, where they all took a national assessment. And I'm not going to go through all the results, but basically they found a similar pattern of results in Northern Ireland to England. So we got replication with a different population. But what's interesting here, look at this last thing. Children who attended a high-quality preschool were 2.4 times more likely in English literacy and 3.4 times more likely in mathematics to attain the highest grade at age 11 than children without preschool. Okay? Now, I believe we have some members of the Education Ministry here. I suspect you would like to improve the mathematics performance of your children. Here's one way to do it. Okay. Now, policy impact. This study had profound policy impact in the UK. It led to a free part-time early childhood education place for every child in the country from age their third birthday onwards. This has now been expanded to every child in the 40% most deprived families, 40% of the population, from age 2 onwards. We have maternity leave. We had data on maternity leave also increased to 1 year after the birth of the child. Paid for 9 months, 3 months non-paid, but still you have the right to return to your job for up to 1 year after the birth. We have a new early years curriculum. We have new training programs for early years staff. We have an acceptance that early years spending is part of government responsibilities. It's very interesting that in 2010, when we had a right-wing cost-cutting government came into power, they kept the free early childhood place and in fact expanded it to 2 years, because this is from the Conservative government provided it. So once we won that battle, even the people who in the before the study took place would have been totally against this, have now been won over. And we have the development of children's centres, which is still an ongoing story. Okay, there's a series of references where you can read up the evidence in more detail that I've been telling you about.